electrical activity of the heart. This is Dr. Francis's second lecture. So in this lecture, we are going to talk about conduction system and how it is that the heart gets the actual potential to contract in the first place. We have a lot of objectives for this lecture, so just let's get into it. So for starters, I want to explain the conduction system. So that's when we have these nodes in the heart, and that's what's going to control the actual potential moving from one place of the heart to the other. So our first node is the sinus node. That's going to be located in that little area between the cranial vena cava and the atrium itself. It sits right there, and that's going to be your pacemaker, and that's what's going to initiate the impulse and the actual potential I just talked about. Once we initiate that impulse or the actual potential, we're going to send the impulse out into this atrioventricular node, which is located between the atrium and the ventricle, but in that little AV valve or AV septum. And from there, we're going to send the impulse to this bundle of His. This whole area below is called the His-Purkinje system, because we're going to have the bundle of His, we're going to have the bundle branches, and then we're going to have the Purkinje fibers. So once we get to this bundle of His, we're going to send the impulse down from the right branch and down the left branch. You can see the left branch is going to have branches going into that ventricle. That's because the left side of your heart is thicker. So in order to get that impulse through that side of the heart, we're going to need some additional branches. But your right side of the heart is thinner, so we don't have these additional branches. We just stay excluded within the ventricle. We don't go into the ventricle itself or the ventricular myocytes. Then afterwards, we're going to send off these Purkinje fibers, and the Purkinje fibers are what are going to actually make the impulse go from bottom up, from apex to base. So once we start the depolarization, it's going to depolarize from bottom up. If that makes sense. Then, once you understand this, we can understand the different physiological pacemakers, which are the sinus node, the atrioventricular node, and the Purkinje fibers. But before I cover that, I just want to quickly talk about the intercalated discs. In formal function 1, 2, it escapes me, but we learned about intercalated disc in the cardiomyocytes, and it's what connects these myocytes end to end. It's those little lines in there. And the components of this are going to be the desmosomes and the gap junctions. The desmosomes are going to be the mechanical connection itself, and then the gap junction are going to create electrical connections between these. And then we also want to know that in the conduction system, we have wider cells that have more gap junctions. That's why we have a faster conduction in these node cells. However, in this area right here, in between the AV node, gap junctions are a little rare. So in that AV node, we're going to have slower conduction. Now I can talk about the pacemaker, physiological pacemakers themselves. So we're going to have the sinus node, the AV node, and the Purkinje fibers, like I mentioned earlier. And the difference between these is the amount of impulses per minute that they're going to send. The faster the pacemaker, that's usually the pacemaker that's going to control the electrical activity of the heart. So that's usually going to be the sinus node, because it goes at 100 to 120 impulses per minute. And once we go down, you can see that it starts to kind of half itself. So 100 to 120, 40, 60, 20, 40. And these pacemakers can generate electrical impulses spontaneously. One last thing to note is that if one of them fails, the other one would take over for it. So if the sinus node fails, the AV node is going to take over for it. If the AV node fails, then the Purkinje fibers will take over for it. Then I want to talk about what the impulse does in general. So we know that an action potential is going to cause the impulse, and the impulse is going to cause contraction. But what ions are involved, like what even is this? So that's what we're going to talk about here. Remember, we have two different types of cells in our heart. We're going to have our contractile cells, which are going to be the 99% of our cells in our heart, and then we're going to have the pacemaker or autorhythmic cells, and that's going to be 1% of your heart cells. Your contractile cells, that action potential is going to work with your sodium. So in order to be depolarized, you're gonna have sodium rush in and gonna make a peak of depolarization, and then this sodium channel is going to inactivate rapidly. Once we're inactivated, we cannot set another action potential, and I'm gonna explain why in a second. But once that sodium channel is inactivated, your potassium channel is gonna open and burst out potassium, and we're gonna have this rapid repolarization state. But then our heart cell is gonna be like, wait, hold up, not too fast. So we're gonna have this plateau phase where potassium is still going out, but calcium is coming in, and they're trying to balance each other, and that's why we have this moment of just plateau. However, these calcium channels are gonna close and potassium is gonna continue to rush out, and we're gonna repolarize to our resting membrane potential once again. Once we get to this resting membrane potential, our sodium channels can close, and once they're closed, they can be reactivated again. So the reason we can't have another action potential while these sodium channels are inactive is because of something called a refractory period. So the refractory period is when an electrical impulse cannot depolarize a myocyte until the end of the action potential. And that's because the sodium channels can be found in 3 stages. They can either be open, or once they open, then they are inactivated. Once they are inactivated, nothing can happen to them. You have to wait until it meets the resting membrane potential once again for them to be closed, for them to open once again, if that makes sense. If they are not closed, they cannot reopen and they cannot create this action potential. Nothing will happen to them if they are inactivated, which they remain to be activated after phase 1. Once you reach the resting membrane potential, then you can depolarize and you can start the system again. Then you're going to have the autorhythmic cell action potential, and this one's a little different because the resting membrane potential over here is about -80. However, over here we have -60, and it's not really called a resting membrane potential because our cells never truly resting. We're slowly increasing with an influx and efflux of sodium and potassium. We're slowly increasing until calcium rushes in and creates that depolarization. As you can see here, calcium is what's causing this depolarization. While when in our contractor cell, it was sodium causing this depolarization. That's a big difference. Once we have this calcium depolarization, potassium is gonna rush out, repolarize, and then we're gonna slowly increase once again. This potential, per se, is called the pacemaker potential. It is no longer called the resting membrane potential because we aren't truly resting. We're slowly increasing once again until we meet this threshold and calcium rushes in, depolarizes, potassium rushes out, repolarizes. Okay. So here are some general differences between them. As I said, over here it's sodium, and over here it's calcium, causing that depolarization that we should know about. Another key feature is that the contractile cells have this plateau phase, while over here the autorhythmic or pacemaker cells, they're not going to have that plateau stage. And lastly, the contractile cells are not going to spontaneously depolarize because of that idea of the refractory period with the sodium channels being inactive. Since the sodium channels are inactive, they cannot be spontaneously depolarized. But over here, since during this depolarization, we don't have any sodium channels, it's strictly just calcium, this can depolarize spontaneously. And then some ions that we should know about that control this is the sodium, potassium, and calcium ions that I've mentioned throughout all of this. Refractory period, like I said, it's the time between the beginning and end of the action potential. And what this refractory period is going to do is going to prevent repetitive cardiac contractions because it allows the ventricle to eject blood and relax before it has to do its next contraction. And then we have 2 different types of refractory periods. We have the absolute, which means absolutely never again. We're going to be impossible to create a second action potential. But then we have a relative refractory period, which is relatively impossible, but it could happen if we have a high enough stimulus. That's pretty much it for that. Now we're going to go into how the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system affect our contraction. So you can imagine that in our sympathetic, which we can also refer to as our adrenergic, y'all know what I'm trying to say. So that's gonna be your sympathetic. You can imagine that your sympathetic system is gonna increase your heart rate, it's gonna increase the firing of that sinus node, it's gonna make your membrane more permeable to sodium and calcium so you can have that action potential. It's gonna increase the rate of depolarization. Sympathetic nervous system is going to make sure that all of this, the depolarization, your action potential, your contraction happens. However, your parasympathetic is going to do the opposite, like always. It's going to relax you. So we're going to decrease our heart rate. We're going to lower our chances of firing the sinus node and this depolarization. Instead of making the membrane more permeable to sodium and calcium, we're going to be more permeable to potassium so that we can repolarize and end this action potential. However, a key note to have with these vagal tones or parasympathetic is that they do not have a direct effect on your ventricular myocytes because they don't have innervation to your myocytes, but their effect is going to be indirect. And then some things to know about is their hormones and their receptors. So your vagal tones or your parasympathetic is going to handle acetylcholine and their muscarinic receptor, but your sympathetic is going to have norepinephrine and epinephrine, and that's going to be within your beta 1 and 2 receptors. So your sympathetic nerves are going to handle this norepinephrine, and then your adrenal glands are going to have both norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then our last objective is to talk about this excitation-contraction coupling. That's going to be the link between the electrical impulse and the contraction of the cardiac fiber itself, and the role that calcium has in cardiomyocytes and how calcium generates the power stroke and how it creates the contraction in general. I did have three prior videos where I explained this whole calcium binds to troponin, troponin moves out of the way, tropomyosin can bind, all of that. So if you want more information on this, I recommend you see those last three videos on Fang's lecture on muscle cells and how they contract. Besides that, that's pretty much all I have. Thank you for watching.